You're so sensitive. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? Why are you so difficult? You are overreacting. After everything I've done for you. Oh, you think you are so important. I don't care what you need. We need your help in this house. Well, if any of those sentences that you just heard sound familiar to you, then you probably grew up in an environment where your boundaries weren't respected. And over time, you learn to put your own needs aside just to keep the peace. After all, you don't want to be difficult. You don't want to be ungrateful. In this video, I want to share with you how you can establish boundaries, how you communicate them, and how you act upon them. Because not being able to set boundaries has two major problems. The first is obvious. People will do something that you don't want, that makes you feel uncomfortable. And the second thing is even more deep. And that is when people overstep your boundaries, you will start to think that you don't deserve boundaries, that you don't deserve the respect. And that's how I felt. As a teenager, my mom would often come into my room without knocking. She would just barge in and yelling about the mess in my room, and she would complain about the household chores that I didn't do. And she was often very stressed and irritable. And to be fair, I get the point. I was a messy teenager, and I could have helped out more in the house. But I think the style that she chose to communicate that with me wasn't the best. And that's why every time I heard her pulling into the parking lot, I'd flinch, because I never know what kind of mood she'd be in, or if she would just rush right into my room without warning. And eventually I would lock my room, and you can imagine how this created a backlash. Still, it gave me a few seconds to prepare, even if I had to face a greater wrath. So I was very desperate. And I often begged her to just knock and wait until I answer. But she wouldn't do it. And when I went to university, I still locked my room just out of habit. And at first my roommates, they were confused because, well, they just knocked and they wait for me to answer. And this surprised me. I didn't know this exists. People would do that because I never learned otherwise. So for the first time of my life, I never had to lock my room anymore. But up to this day, I still feel very sensitive about my space, and I can still feel very vulnerable and upset when someone comes into my room and without knocking or waiting for a response. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here with my family, intruding my personal space and my emotional boundaries by yelling at me and making me feel guilty. But this made me realize early on what boundaries mean for me. At least that was one of my first boundaries, and up to this day, a boundary that is important for me to have. Boundaries are the limits or rules you set to protect your personal space, feelings, time, and energy. They show others how you want to be treated and help you take care of yourself. And those boundaries can change over time. Sometimes you just need to set boundaries to protect yourself from triggers from childhood. And that is necessary. You don't want to be overwhelmed with all those triggers all the time. But over time, you might learn to deal with these patterns, with those triggers, and you will not need the boundaries anymore. In a moment, I will give you a long list of examples for boundaries, so we just get on the same page, and you might even discover boundaries that you didn't even know you might have. Let's first look at the challenges we are facing with boundaries. Because if you struggle with boundaries, you will struggle with at least one of these challenges I'm about to tell you now. The first is you're not conscious of your boundaries. The second, you're conscious, but you're afraid to communicate them. And number three is you communicate them, but others still disrespect them. And before we go into a step-by-step plan to establish our boundaries, I want to talk about principles to maintain boundaries. Because these will be your compass in any given situation. If you keep these few principles in mind, you will be able to protect yourself. So remind yourself of them and add your own. So listen carefully. Okay, the very first principle is so extremely important, and it is you deserve to have boundaries. Your needs, space, and energy are valid. And when you set boundaries, you're not selfish. It's an act of self-respect. Keep that in mind. We will talk about this more in this video, but I think it's so important that I want to say this in the beginning. You deserve to have boundaries. You deserve respect. You deserve to have self-respect. And every time people are crossing your boundaries, it will reflect back to you that you don't deserve them. And you might fall back into old patterns. And I really don't want this for you to happen. And the next principle is boundaries are more than words and feelings, which doesn't mean they're not important, but boundaries need action. You don't just say them, you live by them. Because if anyone crosses the line, the way you respond to them matters at least as much as what you said. Understand, you can set boundaries, you can talk about them, but if you are not able to draw a line, to put in consequences, to act upon your boundaries, if people don't respect them, it's like they don't exist. So keep that in mind. We will talk about how we can communicate and how we can become aware of boundaries, but you will also need to be able to act upon your boundaries. That is the big one. And the next principle will take a little bit of time to really fully realize and act upon. And that is, you don't need the other person to have boundaries. This is so important. I say it one more time. You don't need the other person to have boundaries, because boundaries are not a negotiation. You don't need permission or an agreement. You can and you should hold your limits, even if other people don't like it. Because boundaries, and that is the next principle, is self-love in action. Every time you set a boundary, you tell yourself, I matter. My needs matter. And my well-being comes first. All right, so please keep these principles in mind. We will touch upon them the further we go into this video, because they're so essential. And they will guide you through this very complex world of relationships and people. And I will give you a step-by-step guide right now, but again, the world is too complicated to just follow a step-by-step guide from 1 to 4. And with principles and these reminders, you will be able to navigate through the complexity of our life. That being said, let's look at how we can establish boundaries. Number 1 is, first we need to acknowledge our boundaries. So before you can talk boundaries, you need to know them, obviously. And you probably already know what makes you uncomfortable. But just to be sure, I made a list of potential boundaries that cover all areas of our lives, including work, relationship, and privacy. And every example already shows you how you can communicate those boundaries, which we will look at a little bit more in depth after these examples. But first, let's look at them. Number 1 is boundaries in personal space. I need some time alone to recharge, so I'll join you later. Time. I can't take on that project right now. My schedule is full. Or energy. I'm feeling drained and need to rest. Values. I'm not comfortable with this because it goes against what I believe in. Emotions. I can't handle negativity right now. Can we talk about it later? Or mental health. I need to leave this situation before it's affecting me. Or physical safety. Please don't touch me like that. It makes me uncomfortable. Work-life balance. I'm not answering work mails after 7 p.m. anymore. Autonomy. I've made my decision. And I'd appreciate it if you could respect that. Privacy. I'd prefer to keep that part of myself private, thank you. Or financial resources. I don't feel comfortable to lend money right now. Commitments. I cannot take another responsibility right now. Now, how do you feel about these examples? Was there anything where you said, oh yeah, that I feel exactly like saying that to someone? Or did you go through this list thinking, well, it's easy for you to say that, but it doesn't work like this? You might have thought to yourself, well, it's not so easy to do. It's very hard. And if you thought that, that's correct. It is not easy to do. But it becomes easier once you acknowledge that you deserve boundaries. And I use the word acknowledge because you might already know what you don't like. You probably have a sense of things that make you feel uncomfortable. But you might try to dismiss your discomfort and you say things like, no, it's actually not that bad. I shouldn't bother them with this. Or I should get used to this. If you're protesting, that's totally normal. You've been programmed to think that you don't deserve boundaries. So you need to to learn to understand that you do. And that's why I have a message for you. So listen carefully to what I'm telling you right now. Your feelings are important. Your needs are important. You are worth having boundaries. You are enough. You are enough. Now, you might resist when I say these things. You might still have this inner dialogue, but believe me, it's true. It is 100% true. If you want to flourish in this society, you need boundaries. It is important for our survival. It is important to become a functional human being on this planet. And you have the right to have boundaries, and it is your responsibility to claim them. Claim the boundaries. You deserve to do things on your own terms. You deserve to have time for yourself. You deserve to feel safe, or not to be hugged or touched anywhere you don't like to. You don't need to lend anyone money. Or take oversharing as an example. You feel uncomfortable when people just drop all their baggage upon you without asking? Well, that's totally okay. Acknowledge this discomfort. Acknowledge this discomfort. And in a moment, we will talk about how to communicate those boundaries, but you don't always have to communicate them. Again, you don't need the other person in order to have boundaries. You can still, talk about it and discuss and communicate and find ways to make it work, especially if it's a close person, a partner, a close friend. But sometimes you meet strangers and it's just more effective and smart to just walk away. And it's also more realistic. I mean, just let's be honest. Will you stop telling someone on the street to stop oversharing? Probably not. Not everyone. Sometimes you will just withdraw, try to stop the conversation and go. And maybe go somewhere else next time. You should definitely start to distance yourself from people who drain your energy. So leave the conversation and walk away. So once you have a sense of your boundaries and in all different areas of your life, and you acknowledge them as well, you acknowledge that you have them and you can have them, then you're ready to start changing your life and everything according to your desires. So let's move on to step number 2. Set the stage, which means establish a safe environment. We need to talk about the environment that you are in. Why? Because if you want to set boundaries, you need to be very, very brave. You will need to fight your own programming, fight your inner demons. And if you are still living in an environment that holds you back, this fight against your own inner demons will become even harder, if not even impossible. Even if you are in a healthy environment, it will be so hard for you to set boundaries, to start learning to set boundaries. So it is so important that you are in an environment that helps you to flourish. Otherwise, you will be struggling with your boundaries and you will just keep being stuck. So you need to recognize harmful environments. I give you 3 examples of harmful environments that can hold you back. The first one, obviously, is the family. It doesn't have to be the family, but in some cases, and sometimes it is just harmful in some aspects. It doesn't mean you have to come from a very bad family. I didn't come from a bad family, but there were things that I could not communicate, or even if I did, I felt bad about it. Remember my story with the knocking? I couldn't communicate it, or it wasn't respected. So when I left to France after school, I was living and working in France in a children's home. I became a different person. I finally had my own room, my own space. I started playing guitar, started singing and dancing, and I could breathe for the first time in my life. I couldn't imagine that I could feel this way. And this is often the best boundaries that we can set as a young adult. Get distance, get perspective, take time to heal. Take time to become the person that you are meant to become. And the second environment is also very easy to recognize. Have you ever tried to tell your friends about something new that you tried, like journaling, dancing, or setting boundaries? And have these friends, how did these friends react? Did they make fun of you? Did they show resentment? Did they ignore what you were trying to tell them? Well, that is a sign that this friend group that you are in is a harmful environment. It's a toxic friend group. They might not even be bad people, but they just don't have an idea about what you need to grow. They might have not been able to establish their own boundaries, so you go try and it looks arrogant to them. So this is it's hard to leave these groups, but it's important for you to recognize them and, well, be aware that you might be around people that will stop you from growing. The third environment is at work. Of course, I've been working in a agency, in an office, where basically when you delivered work, it sounded like, you suck, do it again. And when you wanted to show vulnerability of some sort, people would tell you, laugh at you, and just say, you're such a pussy, come on, get your head out of your ass. It was the prime example of a toxic masculine environment. And if you wanted to become a different person, if you are talking about emotions, if you talk about passion too much, people would just make fun of it. And of course, I needed to leave that place. Imagine I would have said something like, give me just a moment to process this. Or can you come back to me later after I finished my task? I couldn't say this to my boss without being ridiculed. Everybody I know left this place, and many of us became friends afterwards, because all of us had the space and the time to actually develop our personality and find a space to become friends, really. And of course, there are many other toxic environments, so it's very important that you are able to see the patterns of these environments. For example, are people making fun of you? Are they showing resentment when you are trying something new, or if you're trying to set boundaries? Do they ignore your needs and aspirations? Do they give you time to grow in general? Of course, it's very hard to leave people in your environment, to just go. But just look out for these patterns and see what it does to you. And eventually, look for people who are not doing that. Look for people who are trying to help you grow, who are excited about you when you are talking about things that you want to do and that you aspire to. When you communicate a boundary, who will say, yeah, I totally respect that. Thank you so much for telling me. I will try my best to value, to respect your boundary. These are the people you need in your life. These are the people that you need in your life. Watch out for them. And if you have them, keep them. Keep them. In the next step, you will learn how to communicate those boundaries. And no matter what you decide to do with your environment that you are in right now, try to start with the person you feel safe the most. A person where you don't feel afraid. A person that understands you and wants the best for you. Because it is so important that you receive positive feedback right away. Because you are still learning to set boundaries, right? So if you are trying and the first time it already fails and someone makes fun of you, you will fall back into old patterns. And that would suck. So you need positive reinforcement. Okay, step number 3, we have done our homework. So now it is time to establish the boundaries. Because of course, in most cases, we want to tell the people in our lives when they cross a line and how to not cross the line, right? So we will need to use words. We need to tell them in some way. And from the list that I gave you, you probably already got some material, sentences that you can use to communicate boundaries, right? And you probably have noticed that there's a certain choice of words to bring your point across in a respectful way. But establishing your boundaries is not just about using a set of words, using these sentences. It's also how you say them. If you want to talk about your boundaries, you need to remain calm. You need to be in a state where you are able to be calm, to be in control of your emotions. So when you make a demand and you talk about what you don't want, you are not sounding like you accuse the other person. Even if you use like the right words, if you're emotional about this, it might still sound threatening. And well, we people tend to get defensive very quickly, very easily. That's why we have these techniques that we can use, right? And we will look at them in a minute, what you can say. But first, the most important thing is that you ground yourself. So before you go to the person that you want to talk to, ground yourself first. put your feet on the ground, close your eyes, and just take a breath. Just relax into your body, right? Feel your head, feel your ears, feel your neck, and just let it relax completely, and feel the ground below your feet. What helps me, if you really want to get grounded, is this little exercise, the same that I already told you. But when you put your feet on the ground, you can imagine that there are roots emerging from the ground and just embracing your legs, and you become part of the earth, part of the ground beneath you. So you really become completely grounded while you take your breath, and you visualize maybe being in nature, visualize sprouting roots into the ground. And after you feel grounded and calm and present, you want to take on the perspective of the person that you want to talk to before you're going to talk to them. Because if you understand their perspective, you will be able to listen to them and take their perspective as they speak. It will help you to connect with them emotionally and understand them, which will then make it easier for you to establish a connection. Because what we want to avoid is defensiveness. So if they feel understood, if they feel, okay, you know how they feel, you know why they're behaving the way they behave, they will feel more at ease, and they will be more open to your suggestions. All right, I think we prepared enough. It is time to talk strategies for the conversation itself. The first one is be clear and specific. Be very clear what you're saying, and you will want to try to leave no room for ambiguity. So for example, instead of saying I want space, you can say something like, I need an hour of uninterrupted time every evening to recharge. The second strategy is use I sentences for obvious reasons, because it will focus more on your feelings, on your perspective, without sounding like you are accusing someone or blaming someone else. For example, you can say something like, I feel overwhelmed when the music is too loud while I'm working. Can you lower the volume? So you probably heard of the concept of nonviolent communication. It's a little bit like that. You say I statements first, and then you make a demand of what you want, what you would like to do. Can you lower the volume? I feel overwhelmed. Could you lower the volume? The third one is be consistent. So when people don't want to listen, or if it seems they don't understand, then just be firm, be consistent, and repeat your boundary. For example, as I said earlier, I need you to call before coming over. It helps me to plan my day better. And sometimes it makes sense to offer solutions or alternatives, especially if your boundary impacts others and you kind of have to find a middle ground. Then you can say something like this: I need some quiet time in the mornings. Would it work if we have our discussions after breakfast instead? The next strategy is active listening. Of course, you want to bring your point across, but you should also be open for the perspective of the other person you're talking to. Even if it's just to maintain a connection, it will make it easier to reach your goal. And it's important that the person feels understood as well. And you can say something that acknowledges the feeling of the other person. For example, I see you're frustrated about change. Let's talk about how we can make it easier for both of us. See, that sounds like a win-win to me. The next strategy is about non-negotiable boundaries. It took me like 10 times to say this word correctly. I probably still failed. Anyway, if you have non-negotiables, then be very clear about them, because these are lines that people cannot cross under any circumstances. For example, I don't tolerate shouting during arguments. If it happens, I'll take a break from the conversation. The next strategy is stay assertive without apologizing. That is a big one. We want to be firm, and we want to state what we need and what we want without sounding threatening, but we want to be clear, and we don't want to leave room for them to negotiate with what we want and what we need. For example, I'm not comfortable lending money. I hope you can understand that. See, it doesn't need to be impolite, but it is firm. Okay, let's talk about step number 4, and that is what happens after the conversation. If the conversation went well and they keep their promise and honor your boundaries, well, that's great. Then you don't have to do anything. This is amazing. But what happens if someone doesn't keep their promise? Well, then I apply a strategy that has basically just two options, and that is repeat or retreat. Sure, you can just go numb and just ignore that people overstep your boundaries, but I don't think this is a viable option here, because it will just pull you back into old patterns, and we don't want that. And some people just need a friendly reminder, and that is okay. We cannot always remember everything. And if it didn't happen on purpose, and if the boundary is fairly new, that is really normal. Remind them, be firm, be clear and consistent, but sometimes you will need to communicate consequences and follow up on them, of course, if the agreement fails. And I think one of the most common and healthy ways to keep your boundary alive beyond words is retreat. For example, you can say something like, if you continue coming home late without notice, I'll have to reschedule our plans for the future. Or if you start shouting during our discussion, I will leave immediately. And you see, so far we have talked about feelings and the words that we choose to communicate our feelings, our demands, our needs. But as I already said, boundaries go beyond that. Consequences will have no impact if you are not able to act upon them. Remember two of the principles that I told you in the beginning. The first is boundaries are not just feelings and words. And you don't need the other person in order to have boundaries. You see, you don't just want to rely on your words in order to establish your boundaries. Sometimes you need to take action. Sometimes you need to have consequences in order to protect yourself, in order to protect your boundaries. And yeah, sure, you can repeat your demands, you can be clear, you can be firm and all that, depending on the situation. But you will come to a point where words are just not enough, and you will need to take action. You will need to take action. This is so important for you to understand, because, well, we are living in a time where we want to discuss so many things, we want to always communicate our feelings, and that is all fine and dandy. It's amazing that we are living in times where feelings can be appreciated by many people, but sometimes people will ignore them. Sometimes people will ignore your needs and on what you want, and then you will need to take matters into your own hands. You and you alone have the power to establish your boundaries. Your boundaries are not just built upon feelings and words. And when people don't cooperate, don't wait forever. This will only make you dependent on someone else's behavior. And you have the power to leave. You have the power to leave, and you will need to be able to leave. You don't need to wait for someone else to acknowledge you. You only need to acknowledge yourself. You're not waiting for their permission. You're choosing yourself. The next strategy is be clear about your non-negotiables. So be clear about non-negotiable. The next strategy is about non-negotiable.